All right, we just finished an interview with Lauren Pratt. Now we're going to visit with her dad, Cameron. So thanks for letting us come over here, Cameron. So tell us a little bit about Cameron and where you grew up and a little bit about your childhood.
I was born in Washington, D.C., and grew up just outside of Washington, D.C. in Potomac, Maryland. And grew up there with, my mom had grown up in the D.C. area, and her parents were there, and most of her siblings ended up back in the D.C. area. So I grew up in Potomac, Maryland with all my cousins. We literally lived right next door to each other. So my parents and their siblings bought property together, and they all built homes next to each other. So had this really fun childhood growing up next door neighbors with my cousins, and going to school with them and going to church with them, and it was a great childhood.
Was this like all through high school you were out there?
Yeah. So I was literally born at George Washington University Hospital in D.C. and then grew up my entire life there, and then went to BYU as a freshman from Maryland. Drove out. I remember as a freshman, starting my freshman year, me and my roommates at BYU were also from DC, and so we all caravanned in 2 cars across the country to go to college as freshmen, and I can't tell you how many times I drove back and forth across the country going to and from BYU. But yeah, growing up on the East Coast was great. I didn't know anything else. We had a really big, strong ward, which was a little bit unusual on the East Coast, but we had one of those wards where people would move there to, for the youth program. And so we actually did have a really large youth group, and it was a great way to grow up.
Was it that Chevy Chase ward?
It was called the Potomac ward, but it was a derivative of the Chevy Chase ward. My mom grew up in the Chevy Chase ward, and as the church grew there, it kind of split off over and over. But that area.
What did your folks do in DC?
So my dad worked with his 2 brother-in-laws and my grandfather in a real estate development and construction business, which is where I work today. So family business that's been around for 60 years.
That's great. Okay, yeah. We're going to hear more about that in a little bit. But first, growing up as a kid, what did you like to do?
So I played a lot of sports. My next door neighbors were my cousins, and there was a boy 9 months older than me and another one 9 months younger than me. So the 3 of us just grew up, we went to school together, and we played on all the school sports teams, played, football in middle school, and then soccer in high school, and basketball and lacrosse, and we did a lot of that. And then we also skied a lot. We'd always go out to Utah for spring break every year with all those cousins, and would ski for, so that's between sports in the DC area and then skiing, every spring break. Those were the big activities. But school kept us really busy. We played sports at school. And so, we wouldn't get home from school till 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, even in middle school. So school was kind of, it was a big part of life.
Was there one sport that was your favorite, or was that you were best at?
I was a decent athlete, but not a standout athlete. So I always made every team, but I was never the star. But I played, like I said, soccer, basketball. I played tennis for a couple years, and then switched and played lacrosse my junior and senior year, and then ended up playing lacrosse at BYU with my cousins and a bunch of other friends. So lacrosse probably ended up being the sport that I was the best at and enjoyed the most.
What was that ward? So you said it was a big ward. What was that ward like, or how if at all is it different than, say, wards on the West Coast?
I would say the biggest difference, well, I don't know. I haven't been in that many wards on the West Coast, to be honest. My only time living outside of the DC area was, my years at BYU. And then when Chelsea and I were newlyweds, we lived in New York City and then Boston, and then lived here in San Diego in the Carmel Valley where you and I met almost 20 years ago. We lived there for about a year and a half, and then back to DC. And then we were in DC for 17 years before moving back here 4 years ago. So I don't really have that much experience with, wards on the West Coast other than the Del Mar steak, honestly. I would say the difference is back there, especially when I was growing up, it was a little bit different because the geographic areas of wards were much larger. And so you would have, I think in my ward, we probably had like 12 different high schools that were represented. And there's in the DC area, there's a big private school culture. So we had lots of public schools, but also lots of private schools. And so, you go to seminary, and then kids would splinter from seminary to a ton of different schools. So like I was the only LDS kid in my grade at my school. And that was totally normal. Like that was not unusual at all. So I would say, while we had a lot of youth in the ward, most of our social life was not with LDS kids. So like all my best friends, none of them were LDS. I ended up having one really close friend that was LDS that ended up living with BYU, but he was in a different ward, different high school. So we didn't see each other that much until like our senior year when we had driver's licenses and, had a little more time on our hands. But the wards were close and the families were close because most other families, I think our family was pretty unique because we did have family there, but almost every other LDS family didn't have any other family in the area. So the ward really did, people were drawn together because they didn't have family. The ward family was their family. And so that might be something that's a little, unique.
That is. And then you said you went to BYU. How did you decide to go to BYU? What did you study at BYU?
So I wasn't, my parents had both gone to BYU. I kind of wanted to go to BYU, but I also, all my friends at my school were applying to colleges all over the place. I kind of wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Thought about applying to a bunch of different colleges, but having kind of gone through high school as the only LDS person in my grade at my school, I was kind of done with being the only sober person at every single party, every single weekend. And there was no I know we tell our kids avoid the drinking parties. There was literally nothing else to do. So if I would have avoided drinking parties, I would have been sitting at home by myself. So I was every single weekend night, I was at a drinking party where everybody was drinking. And I wasn't, and it was fine. I was always the designated driver, but and I had great friends, and they were really good people, and drinking as a high schooler was totally normal. It wasn't like they were bad people doing bad things. That was the culture. So by the time I got ready to apply to college, I was just kind of sick of it. And so the appeal of being able to go and have a social life that with other kids that were sharing my values really, that grew in appeal as I started applying to colleges. And so I ended up applying to BYU early. I back then BYU was not nearly as hard to get into as it is today. And so I think by late September, I knew I was into BYU, and it took the motivation to apply anywhere else out. So anyway, I ended up, I did go to BYU and studied civil engineering. And Claire and I have talked about engineering a bit because she's thinking about majoring in engineering. And I didn't want to be an engineer, but I thought it'd be a good background to have because I thought I might someday go into the family real estate business, and just having that technical degree in engineering I thought would be valuable. So that's what I ended up studying. It was hard, and I spent a lot of time. None of my friends had hard majors, and they had a really fun time in college, and I felt like I just studied for 5 years, just constantly. So
was it worth it? Good.
Yeah, I think it taught me a lot of things. I never worked a single day as an engineer. I went straight from getting an engineering degree to working on Wall Street at an investment bank. So I in that sense, I didn't put my education to formal use. But what I learned was that, and what I tell my kids all the time, is that high school and college is not about what you learn. It's learning how to learn. And so in that sense, because you'll hear high school kids complain all the time, like, I'm never going to need this. I don't have to know how to use calculus. I'm never going to use calculus. And it's true. They likely will not use some of the specific knowledge they gain, but what you're learning how to do is have discipline, and you're learning how to learn. And engineering was great for that because it was very analytical. And required me to learn how to take data and manipulate it to solve problems. And in that sense, I've used those skills for my entire career, even though I've never, designed the reinforced concrete structure of a bridge, which is what I actually studied. But so yeah, it's good.
Why don't you tell us about your career then?
So I decided that I wanted to work in real estate. I didn't know if I was going to work in my family business or out of it, but it's an industry I'd kind of observed growing up, and so it was familiar and interesting. And so, like I said, I studied engineering and then went and worked on Wall Street because I wanted to go to business school, and I knew that that was a good path. Fortunately, some of the guys that I played lacrosse with at BYU were from the New York metropolitan area. The lacrosse team everybody on the team was either from New York or DC. And so I became friends with all these guys that were a few years older than me, that were from the New York area. And a couple of them went into investment banking. And so that's kind of how I learned about it. And they were great mentors for me and really helped me understand what that kind of industry looked like and how I could get a job there. And so I really leveraged my relationships with those guys to help me navigate all that. And so from BYU, I went and worked at an investment bank called Morgan Stanley and did that for a couple of years, and then applied to business school and went to business school.
Where did you go to business school?
At Harvard.
Did you enjoy that experience?
It was great. It was really fun. Chelsea and I got married the first year that I was working on Wall Street, and so our newlywed years were in New York City, which was really, really fun. I was working a lot of hours. Chelsea had a job and would meet like at 9 o'clock at night. You know, if you work till like 8 or 9 o'clock at night, you'd get like a stipend for dinner. So Chelsea had come down to my office was down on Times Square. It's where Morgan Stanley still is today, and she'd come down and would meet at a little restaurant and would like, you know, split an entree so that we could basically have a free dinner. And so those were really, really fun years to be living in New York City together as a newlywed couple. And then our first son, Ben, was born right as we were leaving New York to move to Boston to go to business school. And so we had 2 years in Boston together with a newborn. And it was great business school. There were several other LDS couples that were in our class. And you know, most of the business school class is single, and then you have a handful of married people, and they're disproportionately LDS. And so we had a really, really close group of friends there that we've stayed with several of them stayed really close to, you know, till this day. And so it was business school was just a really interesting experience, very intellectually stimulating. You met a lot of interesting people. And after working, you know, 100-hour weeks for the 2 years prior on Wall Street, it also felt like a break. So it was really fun.
Yankees or Red Sox?
Ooh, you know what? I lived in New York and I lived in Boston.
I know.
And
make a choice.
And so this is the thing. I was an Orioles fan growing up in DC.
Oh, okay.
And so it was really hard to you know, the Yankees and Red Sox are American League East rivals. So it was hard to cheer for either of them. But because we moved around a lot, I have a theory about rooting for sports teams. You always root for your hometown team, but you never want to live in a city and root against the hometown team there. So when we lived in New York, you just don't want to be the guy that's in New York that hates the Yankees. That's not cool. And the same thing with Boston. So when we lived in New York, I'd cheer for the Yankees. When we lived in Boston, because I just always cheer for the hometown team, but then I'm always loyal to my DC teams. So
that's a fair answer.
Some people call it a cop out, but like, you know, when you got a friend and they live in San Diego and they hate the Padres, it's like, come on, you know, you can't hate the hometown team. So
yeah, that's fair. I was thinking of some people I know that we might have to go have this conversation with. So tell me, experience at Harvard. I'm sure there's some interesting experiences. Any experience stand out in particular from your graduate years there at Harvard?
Man, there are a lot. I would say that I was blessed at Harvard. Well, one of the things that was unique, I would say, about our experience there is when we were there, the dean of Harvard Business School was a guy named Kim Clark. Who was LDS, right? Went on to be the president of Ricks College. He actually left Harvard Business School to become the president of BYU Idaho, which I can't even begin to tell you the shockwaves that you know caused in the Harvard community, that he would leave an institution like Harvard Business School to go be the president of a couple thousand student university in the middle of Idaho. But because of that, as he led Harvard Business School, and he was incredibly well respected, there were several LDS faculty members. And so the Mormons were actually a very visible part of Harvard Business School, not only the faculty, but also the students. And that was pretty neat. And so at the time, there were multiple faculty members there at the time that became general authorities, including Clayton Christensen, a current general authority named Clark Gilbert. And so we got to interact with those people who were incredibly well respected in a very rigorous academic institution. And I would say one thing that was really neat about the experience of interacting with them is how open they were about their beliefs. And that left a lasting impression on me, that they would be so open and vocal about the things they believed in. They weren't they weren't preaching at all, but they would never back away. Like Kim Clark, during the first year, he would, go around to each, they call them sections. They're, basically cohorts of people. He would come to your class and do kind of a question and answer thing. And he was very open about his faith and about why he was a believer. And, it was just really neat. And as a member of the church there, just seeing the example of these people that were so, kind of revered in kind of a secular way, to also stand up for what they believe. Not stand up. No one was attacking them, but just
stand out.
But stand out and be proud of it was neat. And then Clark Gilbert, he had just finished his doctoral program and then got hired by Harvard to be a professor. And so the very first class he ever taught as a Harvard Business School professor, I was in. And he's only a few years older than me. And so we became friends, and it was neat to go to class not every day, but every other day for a whole semester, and just watch him. And he'd have a whole section over at his house for dinner, and he would talk very openly about his faith and that kind of thing. And then when Kim Clark left to go to BYU Idaho, he asked Clark to go with him to BYU Idaho. And I remember having a couple conversations with Clark just about the experience that he had into making that decision. So several touch points about these LDS leaders at Harvard Business School that just watching their example certainly had an effect on me.
I'm going to take a guess here that during the course of your experiences and career, you've learned how to make hard decisions that incorporate the Spirit. Mm-hmm. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I pray a lot about business, and that's one thing that it's interesting. When the last round of ward conferences, as in my calling, I get to go around and teach the young men in every ward during ward conference. Your mom does it with the young women. And the lesson that I taught last time was about how your mission will change your life. And one of the things I taught the boys, I taught them about how I gained a testimony that God answers prayers. And I told them a story about an experience out of my mission where I really gained a testimony that God answers prayers. And what I was trying to do was connect the dots that some of the things that I learned on my mission still bless me today. And that was one of the things. And I told them at the time, I'm dealing with a business issue that I don't know the right answer to it. I don't know how to handle it. And I'm praying about it all the time. And that's still going on. I haven't gotten to, this is now, been going on for almost a year now. And I make it a matter of prayer almost every single day. And so, and I don't always get this this answer that gets revealed to me, but I just feel like I need the guidance of the Spirit in trying to figure some of these things out. And yeah, you do make a lot of tough decisions, and I do believe deeply that that Heavenly Father, in Alma, it talks about I think it's Alma 37:30. I don't know, I can remember the exact verse, but it talks about pray. It's some scriptures about prayer, and it says pray over the flocks of your fields. Well, the way I interpret that is in that day, the flocks of the fields, that was their business. That was their livelihood. And so I take that to mean like Heavenly Father's inviting us to pray over not just our families and not just our church callings, but also the flocks of our fields, which to me is my career. And so I do pray about, about things I'm dealing with at work all the time. And sometimes I do have kind of promptings and sometimes I don't. But I feel like, if I'm soliciting the advice of the Lord, as I'm working through things, figuring out, the Spirit is helping me along the way.
That's a great point. One thing I skipped over was about your mission. Can you tell us about your mission?
Yeah. So after my freshman year at BYU, I went on a mission and I was called to Kiev, Ukraine, now mostly pronounced Kyiv, which is the Ukrainian pronunciation versus Kiev, which is more of the Russian pronunciation. And when I went, this was the spring of 1993. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and the Soviet Union kind of dissolved in 1991. So this was, less than 2 years, about 2 years after the Soviet Union had fallen apart. We had, the first missionaries that opened up those countries had just gotten home, and they were my teachers in the MTC. Mm-hmm. So we were there, very early on, and I learned Russian because we did not have the Book of Mormon in Ukrainian yet. And so at the time when I went, all the Ukrainian missionaries, all the missionaries called to Ukraine were still speaking Russian. And actually, some of the people that I worked with at church were in the process of translating the Book of Mormon into Ukrainian while I was on my mission. And so it was a really interesting time to be there. We had, after 70 years of it being illegal to practice any sort of faith in the Soviet Union, there was a huge interest in religion. And so there were lots of, we had lots of people to teach. There was just a genuine curiosity about it in the country. And then the novelty of an American speaking their language was also something they were just curious about. And so between a curiosity about religion and a curiosity about an American that spoke their language, those two things, we'd stop people on the street and they'd want to talk. And so we did have a lot of success at that time. That's changed significantly. Now they're not having as much success in those countries, but in the early days, there was a lot of success. And, we really felt like we were growing the foundation of the church there. And our mission president would talk about that. The people you're baptizing or teaching are going to become the future leaders of the church. And that, proved to be true. And so it was just a very exciting time. It was very much kind of a third world country back then. I had not been westernized at all. There was no McDonald's. There was nothing like that. There was a Benetton store. That was it. If you remember that old brand. But that was like the most Western thing we had there. And other than that, it was like you were living in the Soviet Union, bread lines, all that. So it was quite an interesting, time to be there, an interesting place to be. And, watching what's been going on there for the last year with the war, a year and a half now, has just been gut wrenching, especially early on, those early days, because every reporter standing on the street in Kyiv, I knew exactly where they were standing. They were, we served mostly just right downtown because that's how, the former Soviet Union, they built all this big government block apartment buildings. So they're very dense cities and then nothing out in the suburbs. So all the missionaries were just right in the dense city. So it's been hard to watch what's been going on over there, but I've got really wonderful memories of my mission and the time I spent there.
Do you still speak Russian? Use it at all?
I found a barber right here in Encinitas that's Russian. And so when I get my hair cut once every 6 or 8 weeks, I try to speak Russian. But the problem is there's just so few opportunities to really have people to speak with. So right. My Russian's gotten very rusty. I still understand it pretty well, but it's recalling the words is sometimes hard. The barber told me I'm like a dog. He goes, you understand everything, but you can't say anything.
So tell us how you met Chelsea and fell in love and got married.
So I met Chelsea. She had gone to Rick's College before her mission, and she had been friends with a friend a guy that I knew, And so when she got home from her mission, she was in Provo visiting some friends, and that our common friend introduced us, and we met kind of in passing, very briefly. And then that next semester, she moved into the apartment complex right next to where I was living, and we were in the same ward. And that's how we met. And I was the more interested party. I pursued her for quite a while she dated other people, and then we finally she finally realized what a gem I was, and so we dated for. We dated it was really the summer that right after I had graduated, and so we dated for kind of that entire summer, and then I moved to New York City, and then we continued to date after I moved to New York City, and then not too long after I moved there, we got engaged, and she finished her semester at BYU, so we were engaged, living across the country from each other for a semester, and then we got married in the San Diego Temple 8 days after the millennium. So January 8th, 2000, we got married. And then she
Millennium bug.
That's right. We didn't know if, the world was going to end, but we had,
You don't know what it is, do you, Claire?
I've heard of it.
Nobody had an idea about whether the computers would roll over when it hit 2000.
So there were all these theories
The
that like
flames
the
would
whole,
fall outside.
like everything was going to come to an end. But fortunately it didn't. And we got married 8 days later, and then she moved to New York, and we had this great little apartment on the Upper West Side. And that's our story.
Lauren told us a little bit about your family. Why don't you, though, if it's repeating, it's repeating, but tell us a little bit about your family. We know Chelsea, obviously. Yep. Tell us about your kids.
So our oldest son, Ben, is 22. He was born in New York City when we were living there. We brought him home in a yellow cab in the city. And that was that was an interesting experience. Not the yellow cab, but Ben being born, because Chelsea had two sisters, has two sisters with cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disease, and her youngest sister Lexi grew up in the Cardiff ward, passed away in 1995 from cystic fibrosis, and then her next sister Charlie is a double lung and heart transplant recipient who is 11. I think she's just had her 11-year anniversary of her transplant, and so she's doing really well. But CF's been a big challenge in her life too. So we knew that there was a chance that Chelsea was a carrier of the gene. We didn't have any reason to believe that I was. But we decided that we were going to get pregnant and then would kind of see. So after Chelsea was pregnant, we had an amniocentesis performed, which is where they go in and take some amniotic fluid and run tests. And so long before Ben was born, we knew he was going to have cystic fibrosis, which was really scary, because back in 2001 when Ben was born, it was a much different disease than it is today. And when Ben was born, the average life expectancy of someone with cystic fibrosis was, I can't remember exactly, but I want to say it was like late 20s, like 27, 28 years old. And there was a lot of optimism around some of the things they were working on in terms of treatments, but it was still really scary. And, Chelsea having grown up with two sisters that had the disease, she knew firsthand how hard it was. So that was really scary. Fortunately, Ben was born in New York City. We knew he was going to have the disease. He was, treated at Columbia University Hospital right from when he was born. Incredible care from day one, and he was doing really well. And so we moved up to Boston and decided that we wanted to have more kids. But that was a big decision when you know that there's a 1 in 4 chance that everyone, every time you have a child, that they could have this genetic disease, which was at the time very much a terminal disease. I mean, there was no cure for it, and people that had CF died of CF, and so it was scary. It was something we prayed a lot about, and we decided to try to have another child. And there was a procedure that we decided to use called the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is basically in vitro. But they would fertilize the eggs, and then when they had become embryos, they would let them grow to like 8 cells. They'd pull one cell off, look at the DNA to determine whether the embryo had the disease or not, and then they would implant the embryos that didn't have the disease. And so we were at business school in Boston when we decided to do this, and we kind of scraped together every dime of savings that we had to have this procedure done. And we implanted one embryo that did not have cystic fibrosis, and fortunately it took, and Chelsea became pregnant, and we moved to San Diego. And 9 months later, Lauren was born, and she was born at Scripps in La Jolla, and she just wasn't gaining weight day after day after day. And long story short, she had cystic fibrosis, and so that was another it was a really scary moment for us, and we had a lot of interesting and touching experiences around that. But nonetheless, now we had 2 young children with this disease, and it was uncertain for us. So we moved back to DC and waited a few more years, and both kids were getting all their treatments, and they were doing pretty well. And so we decided that we wanted to have more kids, and we decided it was really the decision we would rather have another child with cystic fibrosis than not have another child. And that was kind of the thought process that we had going into it, and just really prayed. And Ethan was born and didn't have cystic fibrosis, and then 2 years later, Alex was born and didn't have cystic fibrosis. And so here we are today. Ben's 22, going into his 3rd year at BYU after serving a mission, a COVID mission here in San Diego. And then Lauren, as you know, is just getting ready to leave on her mission. Ethan's going into his sophomore year at La Costa Canyon High School, and Alex is going into his 8th grade year at Roger Rowe here in Rancho Santa Fe. So got great kids, and I would say that Lauren kind of mentioned it in her interview, but since the time our kids were born until today, the advancements that have been made in treatments for cystic fibrosis are unbelievable. It's really the best story in modern medicine that a lot of people don't know about. But a local company here in San Diego called Vertex Pharmaceuticals essentially developed a drug that does not treat symptoms of the disease. It treats the basic genetic defect of the disease, and it is a miracle. It's something that we just feel like our prayers, we prayed every single prayer for 20 plus years that there'd be a cure for cystic fibrosis. And like Lauren said, it's not a doctor wouldn't call it a cure because you have to take a pill every single day, and it doesn't work exactly the same for everybody with cystic fibrosis. But for our kids, it has completely changed their lives, and they are incredibly healthy. And when Ben and Lauren were born, we didn't know if they'd be able to go to college. We certainly didn't know that they'd be able to serve missions, and to have them just be thriving and living, by all measures, very normal lives is something that we are incredibly grateful for. We count our blessings every day.
Listening to you made me think of a question. I've been reading recently, I've been trying to reread all about Alma the Younger's life. So every chapter where it mentions him or he teaches something like that, and there's a theme that in my mind I'm not going to talk about today, but there's a theme that he develops and he repeats throughout. Is there a theme of your life?
Well, that's an interesting question. Wow. Man. I don't know. That's going to be something that I'd have to think long and hard about.
I think Lauren and Chelsea know what it is. What is it?
I
said... They could come up with a million themes to tease me, and one would probably be often wrong, never in doubt. But
that's it.
Is that what you're going to say?
That's what Lauren was going to say. Often wrong, never in doubt.
One of my best friends from business school, that he coined that phrase for me: often wrong, never in doubt.
Let's trademark it.
Yeah, that's and my family, everybody that hears that about me laughs because it rings true immediately.
I always say, if the kids need to know something, I say, just ask me. I've got the answer.
Yeah. Might not be right, but I got an answer for you.
I've got the answer. Yeah. That's good.
So I would say one thing that I don't know if this is a theme, but something that has really resonated with me the first time I saw it, and I've tried to have it be a theme of the kind of the way I've live my life is there's a animated movie that, when your kids are little, you watch lots of animated movies with them, and you might know this one. It's called Meet the Robinsons.
Oh, yeah.
You ever seen that? I love that movie. And they they put on the screen in the beginning, at the end, keep moving forward, and it's a Walt Disney. I think it's a Walt Disney quote. And I think that, I don't know if it's a theme of my life. I would like it to be kind of a motto: keep moving forward. You always have setbacks, keep moving forward. Things tend to work out when you're action oriented, when you're, not sitting back and letting things happen to you, but you keep moving forward and you make stuff happen. Usually, you'll go through ups and downs, but usually you have more ups than downs.
That's good. Best prank?
Oh man, best prank. Lauren got the prank bug from her mom.
Best prank pulled on you then?
So there was a good prank pulled on me when I was in college. I was really focused on trying. I told you I was an engineering major. I was trying to get jobs in finance, and so I had networked into this job to be an intern at a smaller regional investment bank called Alex Brown, and I talked to them, interviewed. They said, okay, we'll send you a letter with all the details on the internship. And I was this is back in the day, we didn't have email back then. And the letter came to my apartment, and my roommates, because they were always home goofing off and I was always at the library studying, they pick up the mail and see this letter. They steam the thing open. They go to Kinko's, photocopy it with the letterhead, and then type a new thing saying, unfortunately, we can't offer you this job. And then they put it back together and handed it to me when I got home. And I was like, I had a long day. I was frustrated. I got home. I was like, oh, yes, I got, and I opened it up, and it was like, unfortunately, we don't have a job for you this summer. And it was like, I'd been counting on it. And I was so down. And they let it go for like 3 hours, and then they told me.
I'm only chuckling bad because I did something similar to somebody. That's great. Claire, you got any last questions for Cameron?
Any last questions? I guess I'll just ask the same question that I asked Lauren. What, like, your conversion story? Like, obviously you grew up in the church,
yeah.
But like, why do you believe what you believe?
That's a good question.
I would say that my conversion story is ongoing. Because I bore my testimony last week in church, and I hadn't done that in a while. Honestly, I hadn't gotten up and borne my testimony. I feel like I speak in church a lot and I teach lots of lessons, so I feel like I'm bearing my testimony all the time. But actually, getting up in testimony meeting is something I hadn't done in a while. And I would say, and what I said in my testimony, which is what I'll share again, is that my testimony has continued to change over the whole course of my life. And, one of the reasons I bore my testimony last week was I wanted Lauren, before she left on our mission, to hear my testimony again. But I was, in thinking about my testimony and thinking about when I left on my mission, how different my testimony was then than it is today. And I wouldn't say it's better or worse, it's just changed. And it continues to change. And life and the experiences that you have cause it to continue to change. And so there have been times where I've felt closer to the Spirit, and then times where I felt less close to the Spirit. There's times where I've studied my scriptures really religiously, and then times I haven't and so you go through these kind of ups and downs in life. But the things that I can look back, and we don't have time today, but I can look back to several very specific experiences that were extremely impactful, where I had a spiritual experience that was so powerful that it left one of those kind of lifelong impressions on me, and it taught me things that have become kind of bedrocks of my testimony. There are other parts of the gospel that I still haven't totally gained a testimony of, but there are a few things, and what I talked about in my testimony last week is the three things that are just bedrocks of my testimony. First, Jesus Christ, that He's our Savior, and I've had experiences, one in particular, where I felt the Spirit so strongly, but I felt the love of Jesus Christ. Not that Jesus Christ is our Savior, because I believe that, but that He loved me individually, and that he knew me and loved me, and I felt that love really powerfully. And so my first kind of pillar of my testimony is Jesus Christ. The second one is the Book of Mormon, and I've read it many times in my life. And like I said, sometimes I read it really religiously and study it, and then I'll go periods of time where I'm a little too casual about it. But I have had so many experiences feeling the Spirit and gaining insights reading the Book of Mormon that I have come to absolutely be convinced that it is from God, and there is absolutely no way that Joseph Smith could have written it. People that are critical of it, I've read all the criticism of the Book of Mormon, all the stuff that point to inaccuracies or this couldn't be true because of, none of those hold water with me, because there's no way an uneducated young man could have written that in the time period he wrote it. There's no way. Plus, I've had a lot of spiritual experiences confirming different things in the Book of Mormon to me. So that's pillar number 2. And pillar number 3 is that I absolutely believe deep in my heart that we have a living prophet. And, and that comes from experiences with many living prophets over the years of my life, where I've heard them teach, or I've had the opportunity to be in a meeting where they're actually there, as a young person, where I felt the Spirit saying that this man speaks for God. And so those 3 things, Jesus Christ, the Book of Mormon, and a living prophet, those are the 3 kind of pillars of my testimony. And then there are lots of other things that I still have questions about. And but those 3 things I have such deep faith in that they kind of sustain me through some of the things that I don't understand or have questions about. And so I'd say it's very much kind of an ongoing conversion. And I think conversion is the kind of thing that I've seen people that I know had testimonies fall away from the church. And so if it's not something that you're always seeking, I worry that it's something that can slip away pretty easily. And so that's kind of how I view my testimony and my conversion.
Well, thank you. I think that's a good place to stop. And I know there's a lot of other stories you can tell all about boats, but people can come and ask you about boats and talk to you about that separately. But anyway, thank you for making time with us today, Cameron. I appreciate it.
Thank you.